Pleasure,
Your views
Lerato.
generally on how the JSE's performed today?
It's been relatively strong. You know, these sort of markets, you always got to sort of consider that the volume is light, so it can be dominated by a couple of stocks. I mean, that are pushed higher, but by and large, this week's been very positive, and it's accompanying upward pressure in the international markets.
And obviously, I mean, it's the commodity story. By midday today, we'd seen gold somewhere in the region of 1,388, although it's ended the day around 1,383. Platinum 1,717. I mean, still surging prices for commodities.
Big performance in commodities, not only the precious that you've just mentioned, but also the base metals. So copper making a new all-time high. So the base precious metal and the energies are sort of moving up in tandem, and that because we're commodity based, as the London market is, and we often take our lead from London. It's been very positive performance. For us, obviously, the problem is the rand. Yeah, we see positive performance in the metals, and it seems to be offset almost always, certainly in the last 18 months or so, by a very strong rand. And I was just having a look at a graph of the rand, not only against the dollar, but against the major crosses, sterling and euro. An unbelievable performance, certainly since the depths of March, April of 2009.
Let's talk about stocks in particular. We've got some news out from Pioneer Foods, and I mean, they've obviously had a lot of bad press about collusion and price fixing, and all sorts of other things. They've paid heavy penalties, but right now they seem to be sanctioning their managers. Is that a little too late?
I would think so. I mean, if you're going to sanction your managers after you've been sanctioned publicly and financially by the regulators, it indicates there's been a breakdown in communication somewhere within Pioneer itself. But I mean, somebody has to take the fall, I guess, and you'd be arguing for the chief executive to go, not lower level managers. If they're sanctioning lower level managers and this type of activity was going on without the executive knowledge, it begs what were they doing?
And then other news coming out of that stable is also the fact that they may be reducing their stake in KWV. Now the question is, who would be interested buyers in KWV? Because we've seen some pretty good performance from them, but not quite the performance that is commensurate with the equity. Yeah,
there have been a number of suitors for KWV over the last little while. I'd be stuck for sort of nominating who would be strongly interested, but I was having a look at their performance over the last little while. It hasn't been great. I know people were or interested companies were sort of downgrading the cash element and along with the performance being reported out of KWV.
Northam Platinum with a trading update, headline earnings per share to fall somewhere in the region of 58%, could even be 75%. They had a few problems this year with mine closures.
It's really unfortunate. We're seeing sort of record highs in the precious metal complex, and we have these sort of operating problems at Northam, and it's been a feature of South African mining certainly over the last couple of decades. And from an investment perspective, I know we're talking equities here, but sometimes it's better, and we do have instruments available for South African investors. If you want to have a view on gold or you want to have a view on platinum, there are plenty of vehicles that you can invest directly in the commodities without having to worry about the associated operational and labour issues with mines here in South Africa.
I mean, obviously there are a lot of questions right now about whether mining is the space to enter at the moment. Reforms in terms of the mining charter, reviews of targets on equity and all those kinds of issues. So it's a very politicized environment, but more so a challenging environment if you're a junior miner. Your views on mid-tier miners, particularly within the platinum space?
Junior miners as a whole. Let's look at platinum. Clearly we need strong industrial performance in the developed world, and ongoing performance in China for platinum because of its industrial application. For the junior miners to do very well, we'll need I think a relatively weaker rand. The stronger miners can withstand the pressure. They've better capital reserves and what have you than the junior miners. So I think that if you are looking for hugely improved performance in the precious metal sector, and I'm not 100% sure that it will. You'll need a weaker rand for the junior miners to perform. Then if that trifecta comes down, good money to be made in the junior miners.
Let's turn our attention to Europe, because you did say that it has bearing obviously on what's happening locally. And last week we heard of Moody's wanting to review its credit rating of Spain because they weren't sure about their fiscal health. And now we're hearing about France. That's the second largest economy in Europe.
Yeah, the European authorities don't seem to be able to cauterize this problem, do they? The ratings agencies only ever move after the market's moved. So the market have, by selling bonds, by buying credit default swaps on all of these countries, they've already downgraded countries like Greece, Italy, Ireland to varying degrees. And I think it's natural that they would start going and having a look at, say, France. And I did notice that the credit default swaps on France have pushed out over 100 points. And I think internationally they've got a worse credit rating or a worse level than the Czech Republic at the moment. So that's a bit of a blow for French pride at the moment, I would imagine.
I mean, just talking about this issue, we know that EU ministers met at the end of last week to try to introduce some sort of a mechanism for stability, whatever that means. I'm going to ask you to answer that. But I mean, in the midst of failed alternatives, for instance, countries not meeting the protocol on budget deficits, sovereign debt issues and not being able to honor debts, rising insurance costs for sovereign bonds and that sort of thing, the IMF coming in. What would a stability mechanism entail in this environment?
What it entails is that there is credibility in terms of the austerity programs in the peripheral countries. Now the short-term problem with that, and the markets are anticipating the short-term problems. The problem with austerity in the short term means that tax revenues are more than likely going to fall, which means over the short term the budget deficit will perhaps increase. But the financial stability is crucially dependent on the credibility of the fiscal plans going forward. Now, at the meeting last week, the Germans came out on top, because this whole process is really about how much the Germans are prepared to put at risk in order to backstop their weakest, generally southern neighbours. And Angela Merkel won it hands down. There was very little likelihood that the rest of Europe would be able to attach the German balance sheet. They've been through that. They've done 20 years with East Germany. They know how much this costs. And they certainly defeated the proposal about issuing Eurozone bonds where they would all be jointly liable for the debts of each other.
Within this conversation, China added its voice by basically saying that they back proposed measures to stabilize Europe. What does that mean, they back? Because they're already exposed to US Treasury bonds. Are we going to see the Chinese mopping up some of this debt?
The Chinese will certainly mop up some debt at attractive prices. But remember, the middle part of last year, they started diversifying out of the US dollar into the euro, which is perhaps the worst possible time. We fell from 151 to, I think, 119. So they couldn't have chosen a worst possible time. They're very interested in providing some stability for Europe, not only because of the enormous amount of trade between the Eurozone and China, but they need an avenue for their investments. So it's very important that they see not necessarily strength in the Eurozone, but they need to see the stability.
And a final question to you, Andrew. Let's cross over the pond to the United States. We're told that the US market's been performing better in the last 3 weeks. Could we attribute that to QE2 or the fact that their equities are doing a lot better?
Well, certainly over the last 2 to 3 weeks, the financials have done very well, and I've heard various reasons attributed for that, including the fact that the yield curve is steepened, making financials, certainly mid-tier financials, relatively more attractive. There is a vast pool of liquidity available in global markets, and it needs to find a home. And people are faced with this dilemma of, do I leave my money in the bank at 0.1%, or do I invest in risky equities? For the moment, it's looked very strong. Technology has performed relatively well. The banks have done very well in the last 2 to 3 weeks. So it remains to be seen. You know, we're at two-year highs. It remains to be seen how far we go.